In 1942, a military transport driver steered his truck off a lonely stretch of Australian highway and pulled over on a rise of red earth. Australia was at war. The city of Darwin had recently come under direct attack for the first time in the nation's history, and convoys of soldiers were now moving along this same remote corridor, hundreds of kilometres from anywhere. And there, hovering above the heads of his fellow servicemen, was something that should not have been there, a small silver object, holding perfectly still and silent in the desert air. He had just enough time to grab his camera before it climbed and vanished. That account has survived for more than 80 years, passed down through a single family. Alongside dozens of others like it, roadhouse workers, long-haul truck drivers, campers, all reporting lights and craft they could not identify in the same stretch of desert, decade after decade. Today, the surrounding region carries an unofficial title, the UFO capital of Australia. But long before any soldier looked up and saw something impossible in the sky, the people who have lived on this exact ground for tens of thousands of years already knew it was different. They knew it long before science had a name for what makes it strange. This is Karlu Karlu, known to most of the world as the Devil's Marbles. And scientists, historians, and the traditional custodians of this land are still working out exactly what is happening here and why. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel is dedicated to the ancient history, deep geology, and unexplained mysteries hidden across the world's most remote landscapes, researched carefully, and told with the respect these places, and the people who have always called them home, deserve. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because we are only getting started. To understand why this place unsettles even the most rational visitor, you first have to understand what it actually is. And what it is almost impossible to look at without feeling that something or someone arranged it on purpose. Karlu Karlu sits in a wide, shallow valley just off the Stuart Highway, roughly 105 kilometres south of the mining town of Tennant Creek and almost 400 kilometres north of Alice Springs, a location so remote that the nearest settlement, a hamlet called Wartime, numbers only a handful of permanent residents. From a distance, the landscape looks like typical red centre scrubland spinifex grass. Scattered gums, a flat horizon stretching uninterrupted in every direction. The kind of country that rolls past a car window for hours without asking to be remembered. Then, without warning, the earth erupts into stone. Granite boulders, hundreds of them, scattered across roughly 1,800 hectares of protected reserve, rise out of the ground in loose clusters, ranging from 50 centimetres across to massive 6-metre monoliths weighing many tonnes. Some sit alone, half buried in red sand. Others are stacked 2, 3, sometimes 4 high, balanced on top of one another with a precision that looks deliberate, engineered, impossible. A few have been split perfectly in half, as if cut with a blade, the two halves left standing centimetres apart. At sunrise and sunset, the iron-rich minerals within the granite ignite into deep red and burning orange, and the entire valley seems to glow from within, the same slow chemical staining that colours so much of the Australian interior concentrated here into a single dramatic field of stone. The boulders don't just dominate the landscape, they quietly shape an entire micro-ecosystem around themselves. In a region where daytime heat can be lethal, the deep shadowed gaps between the granite blocks stay noticeably cooler than the open plain, drawing in life that would otherwise have no refuge here. Black-headed goannas shelter in the crevices. Zebra finches and painted finches dart between the boulders in tight, fast-moving flocks. Overhead, fairy martins build small, bottle-shaped mud nests tucked beneath the overhanging rock, sheltered from both the sun and from most predators. The marbles, in other words, are not just a geological curiosity frozen in stone. They are a functioning shelter, still actively supporting life in one of the harshest environments on the continent. Geologists will tell you none of this was placed by hand. It began somewhere between 1.6 and 1. 7 billion years ago, in the Paleoproterozoic era, a span of time so vast it renders the whole of human history a rounding error, when a massive body of molten rock pushed upward through the Earth's crust and came to rest beneath a thick cap of sandstone. Trapped under that pressure, the granite cooled slowly, hardening into a coarse, crystalline rock studded with quartz, feldspar and mica. Then the ground itself began to move. Tectonic forces folded and buckled the crust, lifting the buried granite and fracturing the sandstone above it. As the crushing weight lifted, the granite did something rock is not supposed to do. At least in the human imagination, it expanded. Relieved of billions of tons of pressure, the stone cracked along neat vertical and horizontal lines, splitting itself into enormous rectangular blocks while it was still buried underground, a process geologists call pressure release jointing. For millions of years after that, water did the rest. Moisture seeped into those buried joints, chemically decaying the sharp corners and edges of each block faster than its flat faces, in a process called spheroidal weathering. Layer after layer flaked away, like the skin of an onion, slowly rounding hard-edged blocks into the smooth, swollen boulders we see today. Wind and rain eventually stripped away the softer, decayed material surrounding them, leaving the rounded granite cores sitting exposed on the surface, solid stone islands rising out of a sea of sand, in a landform scientists call a degraded inselberg. Even now, the marbles are not finished changing. This is one of the most thermally extreme environments on the continent. Dark granite surfaces bake under direct sun for hours before plunging into cold desert night. Each cycle forces the outer skin of every boulder to expand and contract, fractions of a millimetre at a time and over centuries. Those tiny movements open hairline cracks that spread slowly inward. Some boulders eventually fail completely. Splitting clean in two witnesses have compared the sound to a rifle shot, echoing across an otherwise silent valley. It is a place still actively being built and unbuilt by forces older than complex life on Earth, a slow geological pulse, felt only once every few years, in the dead of night, by no one at all. Karlu Karlu means, simply, round boulders. It is the name given to this place by the people who have walked this ground the longest, the Warumungu, Kaytetye, Alyawarre and Warlpiri peoples, 4 distinct language groups whose traditional countries meet, converge and overlap at this exact valley. For the wider surrounding landscape, the Alyawarre have another name entirely, Alyawarre. Multiple nations, multiple languages, one shared sacred ground, a meeting place in the truest sense, and one that has functioned that way for far longer than most of the world's recorded religions have existed. For generations, representatives of these different language groups have travelled here, sometimes from considerable distances, to take part in law and ceremony that could only happen on this exact ground, nowhere else would do. This is not folklore attached after the fact to an interesting rock formation. Karlu Karlu is considered one of the oldest continuously significant sacred sites on Earth. Nearly the entire reserve is formally registered as a sacred site under Northern Territory law, and for tens of thousands of years before any surveyor, prospector or soldier ever laid eyes on it, this valley was already a place of law, of ceremony and of story. That significance is not simply historical, either, in 2008, after a native title claim that had taken 28 years to resolve. Ownership of Karlu Karlu was formally returned to its traditional owners in a ceremony held at the site itself. The land is now leased back to the Northern Territory government under a 99-year agreement, and the reserve is jointly managed by park rangers and traditional owners together, a structure that allows the public to keep visiting, while ensuring the people whose law actually governs this ground have the final say in how it is cared for. It is one of the clearest possible signs that Karlu Karlu was never simply handed over to history. It is still, actively, someone's country. You may have read somewhere online that the boulders are the eggs of the rainbow serpent, laid across the valley during her travels through the Dreaming. It's one of the most repeated claims about this place, and according to the traditional owners themselves, it isn't accurate. It appears to be an outside addition, a story borrowed from rainbow serpent traditions told elsewhere across the continent and mistakenly transplanted onto a landscape that already had its own account. The real story, the one traditional custodians have agreed can be shared publicly, is both stranger and more specific. It concerns a being called Arrange, the Devil Man. In the Dreaming, Arrange travelled to this valley from a hill nearby. As he walked, he began braiding a hair-string belt, a piece of traditional adornment worn only by fully initiated men, and so an object carrying its own layer of restricted meaning. As he twisted the strands into cord, loose clusters of hair fell from his hands onto the ground. Where they landed, they transformed, hardening, swelling, becoming the great red boulders that now dominate the valley. On his return journey, Arrange spat on the earth, and where his spit fell, it too became stone. The boulders clustered in the central part of the reserve today. He finally returned to the hill he'd come from, Alyawarre, where the story says he remains. He did not vanish into myth, he stayed. That detail matters, because it changes what this place is being described as. This isn't a location where something mysterious happened once, long ago, and then ended. In the oldest continuous account of this valley, the presence that shaped it never left. That is precisely why, when you visit today, rangers and traditional owners alike ask visitors not to climb the boulders. Not only because of a rule written for tourist safety, although it is that too, but because, under law that has governed this ground since long before the last ice age ended. These stones were never simply stone. It's also worth being honest about what cannot be shared here. Only a small number of the stories connected to Karlu Karlu are considered appropriate to tell to the uninitiated. The deeper layers ceremonial lore, the specific meaning held by different parts of the boulder field, knowledge tied to gender, to age, to standing within community, remain exactly where they have always belonged, with the Warumungu, Kaytetye, Alyawarre and Warlpiri elders who still carry them, and who still travel to this valley to maintain them and pass them on. A documentary can't manufacture what it has no right to explain. Some of what makes this place what it is was never meant to be public, and that too is part of its power. What is certain is this: long before any outsider set foot in this valley, the people who belonged to it had already built an entire framework of law, warning and consequence around these stones. They knew where you could walk and where you couldn't. They knew which parts of the boulder field were open to everyone, and which were restricted by age, gender, or initiation. They had decided, tens of thousands of years before a single geologist arrived with a hammer and a notebook, that this was no ordinary piece of ground. As we're about to see, the modern history of this valley has done very little to prove them wrong. The written record of strange happenings here begins, appropriately, with the naming of the place itself. In 1870, a survey party led by the explorer John Ross was cutting a path through this exact stretch of country, mapping a route for what would become the Australian Overland Telegraph Line, the single wire that would soon connect the isolated colony to the rest of the world. When Ross's party came upon this valley of enormous, impossibly balanced granite, he is said to have stopped, looked out over the boulder field, and declared that only the devil himself could have scattered stones like this, as though some infernal force had emptied a sack of marbles across the ground. The name stuck. Devil's Marbles entered the maps, the colonial record, and eventually the world's imagination, more than a century before most of that world thought to ask what the site was already called. Ross and his men were not passing through out of curiosity. They were pushing a telegraph line across one of the most punishing environments on the continent, in an era when a wrong turn or a dry waterhole could be fatal, and by the time they reached this valley, the surrounding landscape had already earned their fear and their respect in equal measure. The next entry is stranger, and considerably harder to explain. It was 1942, and Australia was newly at war. Convoys of soldiers were rolling along this same remote corridor, and among them was an army transport driver named Viv Martin, escorting troops past Karlu Karlu itself, according to an account later preserved by his family. Martin looked up and saw something hovering above his fellow servicemen, a small silver object, holding still in the air with no visible means of support. He pulled over on a nearby rise to photograph it before it climbed away. Martin's account fits inside a much larger wartime pattern. Across the Second World War, aircrews and ground troops around the world reported a sudden wave of unexplained lights and craft encounters, later given the informal name Foo Fighters, generally attributed by historians to a mix of heightened wartime vigilance, new and unfamiliar aircraft technology, and, simply, an unprecedented number of trained observers now watching the sky night after night. What makes the account at Karlu Karlu distinctive isn't that it happened during the war. It's that, unlike most wartime sightings, this one happened directly over one of the oldest sacred sites on the planet. It's one of the earliest documented sightings connected directly to this valley, and it would not be the last. In the decades since, the roadhouse at Wycliffe Well, a short drive south of the Marbles, began keeping an actual written log of unexplained sightings, a tradition still maintained today. Then, in 1952, came an incident with far more tangible consequences, one with nothing to do with lights in the sky, and everything to do with what happens when a warning goes unheeded. That year, officials selected one of the Karlu Karlu boulders to serve as a memorial stone for John Flynn, founder of the Royal Flying Doctor Service, to be placed on his grave near Alice Springs. It must have seemed a fitting tribute, a piece of the Outback's most recognisable landscape, marking the resting place of a man who'd spent his life serving the Outback's most isolated communities. The boulder was removed and taken south. Flynn had spent decades running the Australian Inland Mission, arranging for doctors and pilots to reach outback communities that had never had reliable medical care in their history. In that light, taking a stone from Karlu Karlu to honour him wasn't malice. It was carelessness, the kind that comes from acting on a landscape without first listening to the people who already knew its rules. What officials hadn't confirmed was that the stone had been taken from a site sacred specifically to the Aboriginal women of the area, a part of the boulder field carrying its own restricted significance, separate from the law connected to a range. It was, in effect, precisely what the traditional custodians had always warned against, removing something from this ground without understanding what it was, or what removing it would set in motion. The consequences didn't arrive as catastrophe. They arrived as 47 years of negotiation. Traditional owners raised the issue again and again across the decades, seeking the return of a stone that had been taken from a place it was never meant to leave. Not until 1999 was an agreement finally reached. The sacred boulder was carefully removed from Flynn's grave and returned to Karlu Karlu, while a different, non-sacred boulder, donated by the neighbouring Kaytetye people, was installed at the memorial in its place. Two boulders exchanged, one law finally honoured, 47 years after it was broken. The fourth entry brings the story into the present. Sightings at Wycliffe Well and the surrounding marbles never stopped after Viv Martin's photograph. They multiplied. Roadhouse staff, long-haul drivers and campers have continued reporting lights, hovering objects and craft that defy easy explanation, decade after decade. In one frequently cited account from the 1990s, a roadhouse worker named Malcolm White described mistaking an approaching light for the headlights of an oncoming road train, until it lifted clear off the ground entirely, at which point, he reported, his own vehicle's engine cut out and its lights failed, forcing him to coast to the roadside in the dark. By January 1995, the sightings had become organised enough that a dedicated research team travelled more than 36 hours by bus to investigate them directly, interviewing roadhouse staff and long-term residents about what they had witnessed over the years. What they found wasn't a single dramatic encounter, but a steady, decades-long accumulation of ordinary people, with no obvious reason to lie, independently describing the same handful of details: silent movement, sudden stops, lights that didn't behave like any aircraft they recognised. By the time investigators arrived to formally document sightings in the area, the logbooks at Wycliffe Well already ran to hundreds of entries, spanning decades. 4 incidents, worlds apart in feeling if not always in distance. A colonial exclamation, a wartime photograph, a 47-year act of restitution, and a dead engine on an empty highway at night. Different eras, different witnesses, the same unshakable sense that this ground does not behave the way ordinary ground behaves. If you're waiting for us to tell you this is aliens, or ley lines, or something science simply can't touch, keep watching. Because what historians and investigators actually found when they went looking for the truth behind these sightings turned out to be even stranger than the legend. Hit subscribe before we get into it. Once a place earns a reputation like this one, theories tend to pile up fast, and Karlu Karlu has attracted no shortage of them. Some point to the sheer improbability of the balanced boulders and suggest they couldn't have arranged themselves through natural means at all, floating claims of ancient technology or a location sitting on some hidden intersection of magnetic ley lines, radiating an energy that interferes with instruments, engines, and human perception alike. Others focus on the sightings, drawing a line from the 1942 photograph straight to the modern logbooks at Wycliffe Well, and concluding that this stretch of the Stuart Highway is Australia's own Bermuda Triangle, an alleged hotspot for extraterrestrial visitation, chosen, for reasons nobody quite agrees on, by whatever is out there. A handful of more elaborate theories point south, toward the Woomera prohibited area, a vast and genuinely secretive military testing zone hundreds of kilometres away, sometimes nicknamed Australia's own Area 51. It's a compelling theory, and an almost entirely unverifiable one. Woomera is real, and its testing programs are real. But no credible link between activity there and sightings this far north has ever been established. It remains speculation stacked on top of speculation, the kind of theory that sounds most convincing the less anyone actually checks it. The truth, once historians and skeptical investigators actually went looking for it, turned out to be far more human than any of that. Start with Wycliffe Well itself. Its reputation as the UFO capital of Australia didn't simply emerge from an unusually high concentration of otherworldly visitors. It was, in large part, built after the roadhouse changed hands later in the 20th century. Its owner at the time, Lou Farkas, recognised what decades of reported sightings could do for a business sitting on an otherwise unremarkable stretch of highway. He leaned into it, installing grinning alien statues along the roadside, covering the walls with UFO-themed signage and clippings, and actively encouraging every traveller who stopped for fuel to scan the night sky and report back. It worked. Word spread. Researchers and curious tourists began making the detour specifically to spend a night watching for lights, which meant more eyes on the sky, which meant more reports of feedback loop that had less to do with what was actually flying overhead and more to do with a roadhouse owner's understanding of tourism. That doesn't mean every witness was mistaken or seeing nothing at all. It means most investigators who've examined the sightings point toward a cluster of far more mundane explanations. This is one of the flattest, clearest, most light pollution-free skies in the country, exceptional for spotting aircraft, satellites and meteors, and unusually easy to misjudge for distance, size and speed. Military and civilian flights cross this corridor regularly, and the Royal Australian Air Force has investigated reports from the area more than once, tracing most of them back to conventional aircraft. Bright planets sitting low on a perfectly flat horizon, atmospheric temperature inversions, bending distant lights. Even the occasional meteor burning across a sky with nothing to compete against it, all of these can produce exactly the kind of silent, hovering, seemingly impossible lights that get reported as unidentified. And when a hard number gets put on it, the mystery tends to shrink fast. Journalists tracking the region's reports in 2017 found that Australia's self-declared UFO capital had logged only a handful of encounters worth investigating across the entire year. There's also a simpler, more human explanation working in the background of almost every sighting here: expectation. Decades of research into so-called UFO hotspots around the world point to the same pattern again and again once a location earns a reputation for the unexplained. The people who visit it arrive already primed to interpret ordinary stimuli through that lens. A slow-moving satellite, a distant light on farm machinery, even the planet Venus sitting unusually bright and low on a perfectly flat horizon, can look genuinely uncanny to someone standing in the dark at a roadhouse covered in alien murals, specifically hoping to see something extraordinary. That doesn't make every witness a fool. It makes them human, standing in a landscape engineered, quite deliberately, to make an ordinary sky feel like a stage. The same pattern holds for the other major claim attached to this place, the rainbow serpent story still repeated across countless travel blogs and tourist brochures about Karlu Karlu. As we've already seen, it's simply incorrect. According to the site's own traditional owners and its official joint management plan, a story belonging to rainbow serpent traditions told elsewhere on the continent mistakenly grafted onto a landscape that already had its own specific documented account. Two very different myths, decades apart, sharing the exact same root cause outsiders arriving at an already remarkable place and, rather than asking what the people who actually belonged there had to say about it, filling the gaps with whatever story travelled easiest. Which leaves the ley lines and the ancient technology theories with nowhere left to hide. No verified magnetic anomaly has ever been recorded at Karlu Karlu. No credible geological survey has ever found anything beneath this valley beyond exactly what you'd expect: granite, sandstone, and instruments that all agree with one another. Strip away the manufactured tourism, the misidentified aircraft, and the borrowed mythology, and what's left isn't nothing. It's something considerably harder to dismiss, because the real reason this place has always felt dangerous has very little to do with what might be hovering above it, and everything to do with what's standing on the ground. Take away the aliens and the ley lines, and Karlu Karlu does not become safe. If anything, it becomes more dangerous, because the threat stops being abstract and becomes something you can actually be hurt by. Start with the heat. This stretch of the Barkly tableland sits deep in one of the most thermally extreme regions of an already extreme continent. Tennant Creek, the nearest town of any size, has recorded temperatures as high as 45.6 degrees Celsius and averages more than 20 days a year above 40. There's little shade among the boulders and even less warning. Heat like this rarely announces itself with drama. It arrives quietly, as fatigue, as a headache, as slightly blurred thinking, and by the time a hiker realises something's wrong, dehydration and heat illness can already be advancing faster than they can walk back to a vehicle. Every year the Australian Outback claims lives this way, not through any single catastrophe, but through the slow, compounding failure of a body pushed past what shade, water and rest can fix. Then there's the terrain itself, the very feature that draws every visitor here in the first place. Those boulders aren't decorative. Many weigh several tons, and a significant number are balanced in configurations that look precarious because they are precarious, resting on points of contact no larger than a dinner plate, held in place by nothing but their own weight and geological luck. Rangers ask visitors not to climb them for reasons that are simultaneously cultural and starkly physical. Granite turns deceptively slick, especially at the exact times of day. dawn and dusk, when the light is best for photographs and the temperature has just begun to shift. Gaps between boulders form narrow, shadowed crevices, easy to misjudge, easy to fall into, hard to climb back out of, in a landscape where a raised voice might not carry to another living soul for hours. And the rock is not finished moving. Remember that nightly cycle of expansion and contraction, the same thermal stress that's been quietly splitting these boulders in half for millions of years? It hasn't stopped. It is, right now, continuing to open hairline fractures inside stones that have already stood in place for longer than the human species has existed, which means that somewhere in this boulder field, at some unpredictable point in the future, another multi-ton fragment will eventually let go the same way its neighbours already have, cracking apart with no warning beyond a sound like a gunshot in the dark. Finally, there's the isolation, which turns every other risk here from an inconvenience into something that can genuinely kill you. This isn't a park with a visitor centre and a first aid station every few hundred metres. Alice Springs, the nearest town of any real size, sits almost 400 kilometres south. Darwin is closer to 1,000 kilometres north. In between, a scattering of tiny roadhouses, hundreds of kilometres of two-lane highway, and long stretches where a vehicle breakdown, a snake bite, or a fall between two boulders becomes a genuine emergency simply because help is measured in hours, not minutes. Mobile phone coverage, where it exists at all in this part of the territory, is patchy at best and frequently non-existent, which means the modern safety net most travellers take for granted, a quick call for help, simply isn't available for long stretches of this drive. A twisted ankle in a boulder crevice, or a car that won't restart in 40-degree heat, can turn from an inconvenience into a survival situation in the time it takes the sun to move a few degrees across the sky. More than 100,000 people now visit Karlu Karlu every year, drawn by exactly the same otherworldly beauty that first unsettled John Ross in 1870. That popularity can create a quiet, false sense of security. A well-marked walking track and a busy car park are easy to mistake for real infrastructure, when in truth the same heat, the same unstable rock, and the same enormous distances to real help are sitting just a few steps beyond the path, waiting for anyone who wanders slightly too far or stays a little too long. None of this required a single supernatural explanation. Heat, gravity, isolation, and slow-moving stone 4 entirely mundane forces, and every one of them capable of ending a life. Which brings the story back, finally, to the people who have always called this valley home. Long before any ranger installed a sign asking visitors not to climb the marbles, the traditional custodians of this land had already built an entire body of law around exactly this landscape, which areas to enter, which to avoid, when to travel, how to behave once you arrived. It was never framed in the language of thermal stress fractures or heat exhaustion. It was framed as law, as respect, as consequence. But strip away the vocabulary, and the underlying knowledge lines up with modern science with uncomfortable precision. They knew this ground demanded caution, and they built that caution into culture, into ceremony, into rules passed down for tens of thousands of years, because they had watched this landscape long enough to understand exactly what it could do to someone who didn't respect it. Science didn't disprove the old warnings. It just took roughly 400 generations to catch up to them. Karlu Karlu is, in the end, exactly what it has always been. A valley of granite, shaped over 1.5 billion years by forces with no memory and no intention, and laid over that same stone. Tens of thousands of years of human law, story and memory, placed there by people who understood this ground better than anyone who came after them. The soldiers who saw something impossible in the sky, the officials who learned the hard way what it costs to remove a stone without asking first, the geologists tracing pressure release joints back 1 billion years. All of them were arriving, in their own way, At the same conclusion the traditional owners reached long before any of them showed up. This was never ordinary ground. We want to know what you think. Is there still something unexplained happening in that desert sky? Or has science finally closed the file on Karlu Karlu? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more of the world's most remote, most misunderstood places, researched carefully and told with the respect they deserve, subscribe now and we'll see you in the next one.